This is the smell of the leftover tuna fish sandwich you left in your lunchbox over the weekend in a wimpy trash bag.
Wimpy, wimpy, wimpy!
Blech! And this is the smell of that same sandwich in a hefty, ultra-strong trash bag.
Hefty, hefty, hefty!
Smell the difference? Hefty Ultra Strong has Arm & Hammer with continuous odor control, so no matter what's inside your trash, you can stay one step ahead of stinky. And for bigger jobs, try the superior strength of Hefty Large Black Bags.
You're listening to The Drag.
A red, white, and blue passenger train creaked down the tracks in rural North Carolina on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1964. In a private room adorned with family photos scotch taped to the walls, 51-year-old Lady Bird Johnson prepared to give a speech. Her husband, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, was not with her. This was her show, and no other First Lady, not even Eleanor Roosevelt, had ever campaigned without her husband before. The old 19-car train had been rescued from a junkyard for the trip, and some of the nation's top political journalists were aboard. Politically, a lot hinged on the First Lady's speech, with her husband's election just a month away. The brakes screeched as the train rolled into a Husky, North Carolina. A Husky is a town that had written to the First Lady asking her to stop there. The town had a population of less than 5,000 people, but a big crowd had gathered near the tracks for her. One woman woke up at 3 a.m. to milk her cows, all 13 of them. She got her chores out of the way so she could come and see the First Lady and her 20-year-old daughter, Linda Bird. Linda's 17-year-old sister, Lucy, would join the tour later. It had been 12 years since a passenger train had stopped in a Husky. Weeds had to be pulled out of the tracks before Lady Bird arrived. It had been a long, long time since anyone famous had visited the town. Lady Bird emerged from the back of the caboose. It was trimmed with a red, white, and blue awning and had a large, round sign that said, "The Lady Bird Special." President Franklin D. Roosevelt's campaign song from 3 decades earlier, "Happy Days Are Here Again," blared over the speakers. She stepped onto the caboose's back porch and spoke into a microphone.
I understand a Husky began as a railroad town, and I was advised the best thing I could do was to bring along a train load of passengers. Well, I've done my best.
Lady Bird kept an audio diary to record her thoughts while in the White House, and this day struck a chord with her. Here she is, in a diary entry she made a few months later.
A Husky is where I settled down to knowing I was going to enjoy the whistle stop. A small rural community. I was the first famous guest since Buffalo Bill and didn't draw quite as big a crowd as he did, I understand. It nevertheless turned out en masse for me, and such an air of excitement and friendliness prevailed that I began to loosen up, and so a Husky is legendary with me.
The Lady Bird Special will go down as a shrewd campaign move by an often underestimated First Lady. But this podcast isn't really about policy. Instead, it's about the woman who quietly observed and meticulously recorded history. A woman who adored her East Texas roots, but couldn't wait to see what the world had in store for her. A woman who provided desperately needed stability for one of America's most imposing and difficult men. A woman who dreamed of having a family, and then became a matriarch like no other. Hi, I'm Jade Emerson, and this is Lady Bird. I'm a student at the University of Texas studying journalism. I got into this because I love telling other people's stories, and now I have a chance to tell you her story. Lady Bird was also a journalism student at the University of Texas, and Lady Bird and I are both from small Texas towns. I've fallen in love with her, and I think you will too. We're partnering with the LBJ Foundation for this podcast, and we've gone through hundreds of hours of audio from the LBJ library. For the first time, You'll get to hear Lady Bird tell her story through a series of sit-down interviews she did later in her life. Throughout these recordings, you'll hear historians ask questions on these tapes that they made with Lady Bird and others over many years. The recordings are conversational and often cute.
Can I get you any more lemonade?
Well, this has really been a splendid session.
I told you that quick story about the 1964 train trip for a reason. Lady Bird planned and executed the trip with her closest advisors, all women. I'll tell you more about that in a later episode. That trip highlighted the remarkable transformation of a shy East Texas girl to an impressive and confident First Lady. She had once been too nervous to give a speech at her high school graduation. But somewhere inside, she had the ability to make her mark on history. Throughout this podcast, you'll hear how she bloomed. But before you know Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady, you have to get to know Claudia Alta Taylor. So for the rest of this episode, I'm taking you back to the beginning, to a small town in East Texas in the early 1900s.
There was a lake close to us, which became a very much part of my childhood, called Caddo Lake. Very scenic, interesting, wild, haunted sort of a place, not unlike the Everglades of Florida. Huge cypress trees with big trunks and gnarled roots and hung with Spanish moss and still gray-green water and some alligators and lots of turtles and a few, I'm sure, water moccasins, but that never bothered me. And lots and lots of fish.
Lady Bird loved this place. From the piney woods to the banks of Caddo Lake. I got to see it all when I visited East Texas in May of 2022. She saw her hometown as something magical. We left Austin just past 7 in the morning, heading out to Lady Bird's hometown of Karnak. I went with another student who helped me with the podcast, Cameron Castela. She grew up in Nacogdoches, another East Texas town about 2 hours south of Karnak. My journalism professor, Robert Quigley, drove us. It was the first Friday of summer break. We took the same road that Lady Bird would have taken back in the early 1930s as she drove home after a semester at the University of Texas. Right now, we are slowing down on the road because there is an orange tractor in front of us. It was a few hours before we saw pine trees. That meant we were officially in East Texas. Caddo Lake sits on the border of Texas and Louisiana, each half resting in a different state. Just off the banks of the Texas side is Karnak, a small rural community. Lady Bird was born and raised there, in a Texas bayou, surrounded by pine and cypress trees. When Lady Bird was born, the entire town had a population of about 100. The people of Karnak had tenacity. It was a rugged, isolated area, and they held on by the skin of their teeth because they had to. I knew Karnak would be small, but just not that small. We almost missed it.
Well, that was Karnak.
Really?
Really think that was it.
On one side of the road rests a well-kept post office and a civic center not much bigger than a college dorm room. On the other side, there are a couple of churches and an old restaurant with the ceiling caving in. The entire town is basically a Y in the road, and in the median of that Y is a historical marker for the home of Mrs. Lyndon B. Johnson. We drove past where T.J. Taylor's general store once stood. That was Lady Bird's dad.
It was a huge brick building with the sort of the business, social, everything center of that small community.
Back in the day, TJ's store was the only store in Karnak, so people would come to TJ for whatever they needed. On the front, he painted TJ Taylor, dealer in everything. A wheel of cheese sat on the counter. Cases of candy and dry goods stood against a wall. Upstairs, you could find plows, mattresses, and even coffins. TJ used the money he earned from selling these items to give out loans.
He was the biggest landowner in the county.
As a white man at the turn of the century, TJ was able to build his business and wealth in a way a person of color most likely couldn't. He built his land empire by seizing land from people who couldn't pay back their loans. TJ was often called Boss Taylor, and he was a controversial figure. Some people have been critical of his business practices, but according to other accounts, he provided job opportunities for people of color in the area. TJ's office was separated from the rest of the building. He would sit on a high stool, working on his books and making calls in between meeting people who came to see him.
I realized that people looked up to my daddy and expected him to solve the hard problems and considered him sort of the boss, and lots of them had great affection and admiration, and some of them, no doubt, some resentment to him. I was aware of that, but it was certainly not in the least bit. I just thought that's the way things were.
TJ, a native of Alabama, was the youngest in his family. Lady Bird said he was the type of man who thought he could make it on raw pioneer land. So he headed west, to Texas.
Actually, he got off the train practically as soon as he crossed the line, which I've often wondered if perhaps my spiritual home were more in Central Texas than it was in the land where I was really born and raised, East Texas. But wish perhaps he'd come a little farther. But he was always in a hurry all his life.
But even in his new home in Karnak, where he set up his business, TJ had his eyes on a woman back in Alabama, Minnie Patillo. She was tall and blonde. They got married and TJ brought Minnie to East Texas. 2 years after they got married, they bought a large home just a few miles from Caddo Lake.
She was really pretty alien to the scene there, because she was always sending off and getting books, lots and lots and lots of books, and she would go up east somewhere to New York sometime, to Chicago sometime, once a year to listen to the opera. She loved grand opera. At any rate, she had more cultural interests than were readily available in Karnak.
Minnie took an interest in her husband's business and in politics. She believed in women's suffrage, which would not be ratified in Texas until 1919, 7 years after her own daughter, Lady Bird, was born. For Black women, voting rights wouldn't be secured until years later. Lady Bird remembered one election her mom was interested in. Minnie loaded herself up in a horse-drawn buggy and took off all over the county, campaigning by herself for the politician of her choice.
It was considered rather eccentric of her to be so outspoken in politics.
Back in the car, we had our eyes glued to the sides of the road leading to Karnak, looking for the Taylors' home. Through the pines, I saw a bright green lawn topped with a white plantation house. The family called it the Brick House. The house had been built by enslaved people in 1843. TJ bought the home later in 1902 as a gift for Minnie.
It was a great old house, sort of Greek revival with tall white columns and small porch, two small porches for main floor and upper floor, and then on the back side it was an L, and must have had a Louisiana influence, because it had long, spacious galleries.
In that house, 3 days before Christmas, Claudia Alta Taylor was born on December 22nd, 1912. She was Minnie and TJ's only daughter and youngest child. They named her after her Uncle Claude. But the name Claudia didn't stick for long. When she was just a baby, her nanny, a Black woman named Alice Tittle, said she was as purty as a ladybird. Soon after she had Ladybird, Minnie got sick. Ladybird's 2 older brothers were sent to boarding school, and Minnie began to spend time at the hospital, leaving Ladybird behind at the Brick House with her dad and Nanny. One day at the Brick House, Minnie fell down the stairs. She was taken to the hospital and had a miscarriage. She died from sepsis in September 1918. Lady Bird was just 5 years old. She remembered the last time she saw her mom. She went to the hospital.
And I walked in, and Mother looked at me, and she said, "My poor little girl, so dirty." And she took a napkin off of a tray or something and dipped it in a glass of water and cleaned my face. And I can just imagine me walking in there grubby as can be, and how disheartening that must have been to a woman who probably knew she wouldn't recover. I knew she might not have.
TJ buried Minnie in a country cemetery a few miles from the brick house. We visited that cemetery.
So, we're standing right now by Minnie L. Taylor's grave, born May 16th, 1874, died September 4th, 1918.
Underneath a magnolia tree, there's a family plot with just one headstone. Minnie's grave is the only one in the Taylor plot. TJ later chose another cemetery for himself. Standing by Minnie's grave, I could imagine seeing a 5-year-old girl standing next to her father, saying goodbye to her mom. She looked down at her mom's headstone. It read,
"Forgetful of self, she lived entirely for others."
There's a separate section for black graves at the cemetery. A rusted, tilted-over chain-link fence runs through the center. On the side where Minnie's grave is at, the grass is manicured. All the headstones are upright and clean. But on the other side of the fence, the grass is unkempt and overgrown. Headstones have fallen over or tilt to the side. Even today, the cemetery serves as a stark reminder of racial division in the area. After her mother's death, TJ threw himself into his business, and Lady Bird's brothers studied at boarding school, so Lady Bird was mostly left on her own. Because Minnie died in the middle of the cotton harvesting season, TJ didn't take any time off. He and Lady Bird moved into a store in Karnak so that he could be available at all times. While her dad worked, Lady Bird wandered around the store. There, she said she saw the whole business of life before her. She studied the people who came through the door. She walked around the dry goods and climbed upstairs. And she watched her dad try to process his grief. After her mom's death, she said he was quiet.
I do have a memory of him saying to the preacher, and this must have been, how could I, this young, have remember it? I don't know. But at any rate, he was mad is the only way to express it. Why did somebody her age have to die? And how did that fit in with religion? Why didn't God save her? I remember it, and it's stuck in my mind all these years.
Around the same time she lost her mother, Lady Bird started going to a one-room schoolhouse. It was just down the road from the brick house, so close that often the teachers would board with the Taylors. At most, the school only ever had 8 to 10 students, from 1st grade to 7th. Minnie would read to Lady Bird, but after her death, TJ filled in.
When I first discovered that my daddy could read, my goodness, never saw him doing it, didn't know he could. And he said something to me about, "I'm so sorry you're lonesome and you don't have anybody to play with," and said, "Do you want me to read to you?" And my gosh, it's just like he had suggested something magical. I didn't know he could. So from then on, he used to read to me.
Soon, Lady Bird began to read on her own. She used books to open her world.
I just thought it was the most marvelous thing in the world to know how to read.
On Sundays, her nanny would take her to the black church.
I felt very much at home there and liked it. They always had a lot of emotion in their services and a lot of singing, and they enjoyed them. And I felt a part of them, and I liked it.
Shortly after Lady Bird's mom died, her mom's sister moved in to help raise her. Lady Bird called her Aunt Effie. Each summer, Lady Bird and her aunt would travel back to Alabama to visit family.
Except for my trips to Alabama, in which I was associated constantly with my peers. It was a pretty secluded sort of life.
Aunt Effie, like Lady Bird's mom, suffered from poor health. So Lady Bird, still a child, ended up taking care of her aunt rather than the other way around.
Aunt Effie was one of those gentle creatures that was really not meant for this world, practically. She was a true eccentric, and her health was never good, and I don't know how much it was psychosomatic and how much of it was real. But anyhow, she was one of the most loving kinfolks and that could possibly be, and a great storyteller, and her devotion was so complete.
She and Lady Bird shared a fondness for nature.
Her love of beauty and nature, she certainly helped instill in me.
Through her Aunt Effie, Lady Bird also learned what she didn't want her life to look like. Aunt Effie depended on her brother Claude to take care of her finances. She depended on TJ for a place to live, and she depended on her niece, Lady Bird, for a sense of purpose.
So it just made me feel I didn't want to ever be that dependent or ever in poor health. But there were a lot of women like her in the South, spinster ladies who never asserted themselves or ran their own life.
And even as a child, Lady Bird knew she didn't want to be one of them.
I would quite naturally explore the woods and climb trees and do all sort of things that you might speak of as tomboy things without thinking of it in that way.
The natural world is filled with magic, even more for a girl growing up on her own. Every spring, Lady Bird would go out into her backyard and wait for the first lily to bloom. She'd perform her own little ceremony where she would crown the lily a princess. Even if Lady Bird was alone, she never said she was lonely. Between her books and the nature that surrounded her, her imagination ran wild.
There were lots of violets in the early spring, and a good many pine trees, which had the most mournful but distinctive sound when the wind would blow through them.
When we drove past the brick house, I could see Lady Bird's childhood backyard from the street. Under a canopy of branches, sunshine slipped through. Small flowers stuck out here and there. Insects buzzed between them. I'm from North Texas, and I'd never been to East Texas before. So much of our trip had felt so foreign to me, so strange from the Texas I had known since I was a kid. Lady Bird and I grew up under different trees, surrounded by different wildflowers. Yet, the feeling of her backyard somehow felt the same as mine did. If you spend any amount of time in the natural world, you get used to change. Disruption is inevitable. But Lady Bird found peace in the piney woods. In nature, each end meant a new beginning.
I remember that the seasons were a matter of great importance to my life then. The springtime was my very favorite, and we had a lot of jonquils in the yard, which were naturalized and came up year after year, and a lot of what we call flags, which are lilies.
Lady Bird would later say that her heart found its home in the beauty, mystery, order, and disorder of the flowering earth. Back in Austin, I spoke to historian Mark Lawrence about Lady Bird's childhood. He's the president of the LBJ Library.
It seems to me that Lady Bird Johnson's early life was profoundly influenced by a sense of loss. And it seems that this sense of loss that so hung over her encouraged a sense of introversion on Lady Bird Johnson's part. Many people who knew her, biographers, have commented at great length on the ways in which she would retreat into her own mind, into her own experience, through books, through culture, but also through connection with nature.
In the 1950s, a country doctor walked through the doors of T.J. Taylor's store. A little boy trailed behind him. That was his son, Jesse Marmaduke DeWare IV. He went by Duke. In his hands, Duke clutched his dad's medical bag. While his dad visited patients in isolated parts of the area, like Karnak, Duke would sit with each family. And before setting out for their day, Duke and his dad would stop at T.J. Taylor's store to pick up a 25-cent sack lunch. Duke remembers seeing Boss Taylor as a kid, in the same store Lady Bird wandered around 40 years earlier. We met Duke at his office in Jefferson, the town next to Karnak, on the second day of our trip to East Texas. In his green carpeted office, he had paintings of Caddo Lake in Jefferson at the turn of the century. He sat in a worn leather chair and kicked his feet out, crossing his arms. You can hear Duke's smile in his voice and see it in the creases of his eyes. He punctuated most of his sentences with a little laugh, like this.
And also, she never talked about anything negative. It was always very positive. What are you doing to improve the world? Is basically the question.
As you heard, Duke met Lady Bird's dad, TJ, years before, back when Duke was a kid. But he didn't meet Lady Bird until the early 1970s, after her husband had already left the presidency. The former first couple were in the lobby of Jefferson's Excelsior Hotel, the oldest hotel in East Texas. Back then, Duke had been a 23-year-old law student.
And so I thought, no, I'm not going to let this slip away. So I remember when I walked in the room, or across the room was President Johnson, and, you know, I'm tall, but he was a very presidential image. You know, I mean, he filled the room, you know, and so I went and got him to autograph one of my law books, I think, and then I met Ms. Johnson, and I liked her immediately. I mean, she was very pretty, very charming, and I walked away from there thinking more about her than her husband, because I thought, wow, I mean, she's very special.
Soon after, they formed a deep friendship. Over the years, they would talk about projects happening in the area, from building renovations to conservation efforts. I think they were kindred spirits. Lady Bird moved to Duke's hometown of Jefferson as a kid. Jefferson survives these days as a tourist town filled with antique stores, ice cream parlors, and gift shops. In the 1800s, it thrived as a port town with steamboats traveling to and from New Orleans. At the turn of the century, trains replaced steamboats and the shipping industry dried up.
Jefferson, I just remember as, it was a sort of a romantic old town, and as I said, quite a patrician town, but it was dying on the vine.
As we talked in his office, Duke told us what it was like for Lady Bird to grow up here in East Texas.
But you know what happens in a rural area like where she grew up, children develop great imaginations. You know, I think that Miss Johnson was probably a voracious reader. She's very bright and very modest about it, but very bright. And so I think that she probably dreamed big dreams.
Like Duke said, Karnak was absolutely rural, but there were other towns close to Lady Bird's birthplace. They include Duke's hometown of Jefferson and Marshall, which is the largest of the three. The towns basically form a triangle on the map, and all of them are filled with her touches. When I walked around, I saw a magnolia tree she helped plant in a courtyard, and an antique clock that belonged to her parents up in a hotel. Almost every little store had a Christmas card from her. Throughout her life, when asked about where she came from, Lady Bird always said Karnak, Texas. She never diminished or generalized it. That meant a lot to Duke.
I remember hearing it on TV one time, and when she was First Lady, and a newspaper reporter said, or the person interviewing said, where are you from? And She says very proudly, I'm from Karnak, Texas. Well, Karnak's not even incorporated. Never has been, you know. It's a village, you know, but she was very proud of it. She could have said, oh, I'm from, I grew up near Marshall, or I grew up near Shreveport. You know, she could have said that. But no, she's very, and I thought, boy, how nice is that, you know?
We finished talking in his office. Then, Duke made us an offer.
I've got my truck here, and I thought if, also I'd love to give you a tour around town and just show you what we're doing.
Love that.
I don't get a journalism professor in Jefferson very often, you know, from UT.
So we loaded up in his truck. As we drove around, he leaned over to turn my AC up. We headed to a nature preserve just outside of town that Duke helped set up. In the preserve, the greens around us seemed electrified. A thin layer of algae covered the water where turtles balanced on the top of cypress stumps. And then, Duke taught us his trick to find alligators. First, we got out of the truck.
Okay, now watch your step.
Then we walked down by the water.
Okay, now what happens is when you clap your hands, you look for something to raise up. He'll raise up with his eyes first.
And Duke started clapping. Remember Cameron, the student from East Texas who went with me on the trip? Naturally, she spotted one first.
Where? There he is, right there. There's an alligator. Got him. There he is, that's him. Very good. I am so impressed.
A little ways back, an alligator peeked its head out of the water. It turns out that alligators are curious animals, so they'll pop up at the sound of clapping.
I've had them come up just to right here. They'll swim up to you.
Ladybird shared Duke's love of East Texas. Nature was her sanctuary. Back at his office, Duke told us one of the many reasons he admired her.
One of the things I loved about her was she was concerned about people that, you know, were hurting. You know, she was a healer. I mean, she was so nice about thinking about, you know, like just like the little flower that was over there out of the way. You know, her whole deal about wildflowers. Let's don't overlook wildflowers for all these hybrid, monstrous, you know, flowers when the wildflowers have their own beauty. And so I think that she kind of looked for the beauty in all kinds of people and things, you know, places.
When Ladybird was 11, she moved with her Aunt Effie to Jefferson, Duke's hometown, which is 20 minutes from the brick house. She started high school that fall in 1924. She and her aunt lived with a few teachers in a house just across the road from the school. Even with several pairs of watchful eyes on her, Ladybird's life began to open up more than it ever had in Karnak.
So I went to school there for 2 years and began the business of meeting dozens of people my own age, whereas before that had only been, you know, an occasional one here and there. So, nevertheless, I soon had a few friends, and we did some ridiculous things like dressing up and going into some of the kinfolks' closets and finding old-fashioned clothes and dressing up in feather boas and long skirts and parading around. And you'll find some funny pictures. At least some existed, and I think they're still there, of those days.
Ladybird also learned how to ride a bike in Jefferson.
So I managed to stay on, but I discovered myself going downhill, and I didn't know how to stop, much less slow up. So I finally headed straight for a mailbox on the side of the road, and did indeed stop with a loud crescendo, and got tossed over the bars and into the ditch, and not much damage except a little bruised and scratched.
Ladybird, in many ways, was still a wallflower. And in Jefferson, she didn't go on any dates.
So No, I didn't have any dates, but I went to parties, if it's both boys and girls were. And I remember watching the bigger girls do the Charleston. I never learned how, but I may have tried, but I'm sure I was pretty inept.
After 2 years at Jefferson High, Lady Bird moved back to Karnak and started going to Marshall High School. Marshall was a town close by, but it was bigger than both Karnak and Jefferson. We stopped in Marshall to visit the county's historical commission. There, in an office building just off the town square, we looked through Lady Bird's old scrapbooks and report cards. She donated them later in her life. Looking through the photos, newspaper cuttings, and notebooks, I tried to piece together what Lady Bird's life looked like as a teenager. Under each black and white photograph, Lady Bird wrote out captions in her neat cursive handwriting. There's a picture of her standing on a cypress stump in the middle of Caddo Lake. In another, she stands dressed up on the porch of the brick house, her hands resting on her hip. She labeled it Bird Taylor. Straight A's fill her report cards, which are all signed by her dad. We flipped through the school notebook she'd written in almost a century ago. In between essays and math problems, she doodled, practiced her signature, and wrote notes to her friends, like about bad hair weather. After spending a few days in East Texas, I'd say bad hair weather is an understatement. The humidity dripped off everything, even me. At Marshall High, Lady Bird started writing for the school newspaper, called The Parrot. She may have crashed her bike, but her dad trusted her enough that he bought her a car to drive to high school. She learned to drive at 13. Lady Bird's real growing up didn't happen in town so much as it did at Caddo Lake. Every weekend, she'd head out to the outskirts of Karnak.
One of the favorite things that I always did was to go down to the lake exploring and taking picnics and paddling those little bateaux, they were called. There were a lot of French words that crept in. It was pretty much Cajun country.
When I first started listening to Lady Bird's recordings about her childhood, I felt like she was reading a children's book, a fairy tale of some far-off place so different than my Texas. I became captivated by Caddo Lake and how she described it. Then I saw it. Above me, moss draped off the trees like tinsel. I saw dragonflies hover just above the shore. As the sun started to set, I heard the hum of cicadas begin. Lady Bird knew this lake like the back of her hand. Ever since she was a little girl, she explored every creek and bayou. She had dark eyes and short black hair, cropped in a flapper style. She wore loose-fitting pants with socks pulled up to her knees. Everyone else had already started wearing shorter socks, but not her. On the banks of Caddo Lake, she picnicked next to her friends and took a few sips of homemade beer.
We all paired up and went off and did silly things like going fishing and exploring what a taste of homemade beer, or what was called white lightning, which was liquor, was like. That was my days of prohibition.
She tried to get her friends to call her any number of different nicknames, but only one had stuck, the same one she had since she was a baby. She stared at the cypress trees, growing right in the middle of the lake, surrounded by nothing but water. Like them, she knew what it meant to be alone. Unlike most things in East Texas that grow fast and wild, Lady Bird Taylor grew up slowly. Lady Bird graduated from Marshall High in 1928 at 15 years old. She was set to graduate at the very top of her class, but since she was terrified of public speaking, Lady Bird figured out how many points she'd need to lose to avoid giving a speech. She ended up graduating third. As a high school graduate, Lady Bird began to shed some of her shyness, but in many ways, she was still the same quiet girl on the banks of Caddo Lake.
I was very slow to adapt the standard behavior of my peers.
as Lady Bird graduated high school in 1928, a young Lyndon Johnson took classes at Southwest Texas State Teachers College, 320 miles away in San Marcos. Lyndon's story began farther west, in a Texas rather different from Lady Bird's. He was born in Stonewall, which had few pine trees and no bayous. There weren't any grand plantation homes or alligators. It's the middle of the rocky and dusty Texas hill country, just west of Austin. The ground was hardened by cattle trails and the hard people who lived there. I talked to Mark Lawrence, president of the LBJ Library, about Lyndon's beginnings.
LBJ comes from the hill country of Texas, which these days is a place of wineries and cool restaurants and day trips for, the well-heeled of Austin. But in the era when LBJ was born in 1908, it was not only a backwater of Texas, but a backwater of the nation. In many ways, it was a very poor area without electricity, without running water in most places. Really one of the, it was a pocket of deep poverty. And this was the world into which LBJ was born.
Lyndon's dad, Samuel E. Lee Johnson, was born in Buda, Texas in 1877. But Sam moved to Stonewall when he was 10. Next to Stonewall is Johnson City, named after one of Lyndon's relatives. Sam never graduated high school, but he worked as a teacher in one-room schoolhouses across the hill country. He also entered the cattle business and started to take over the family's ranch. It wasn't long before Sam traded small-town classrooms and cattle pastures for the state capitol. In 1904, Sam won his first election as a populist Democrat Texas House member. As a 27-year-old representative, Sam moved fast, fighting for causes like an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. Sam also drafted the bill that preserved the Texas Alamo. Then, a few years into his political career, a newspaper reporter walked into Sam's life, Rebecca Baines. Rebecca was educated, something unusual at a time when women couldn't even vote. She worked as a teacher and wrote for several newspapers. In 1907, Sam and Rebecca married. A year later, the first of their 5 children was born. Lyndon Baines Johnson came into the world on August 27, 1908, in a small ranch house on the Pedernales River. Like Lady Bird's mother, Rebecca felt kind of out of place in Stonewall. The hill country, in many ways, was still the frontier at the beginning of the century. But Rebecca tried to impress on her children the world that existed beyond the hill country. Here's Mark Lawrence again.
His mother was encouraging him constantly through his youth to go to school, read, imagine himself outside of his immediate circumstances.
As a kid, Lyndon got his first taste of politics by watching his dad. Sam would eventually serve 5 terms in the Texas legislature. I spoke to Mark Updegrove, CEO and president of the LBJ Foundation, about when Lyndon might have first considered politics.
There's no question that when he saw his father, he saw him doing something along those lines. He envied his dad. He saw people spellbound by his father and was, I think, compelled by the power that he wielded and what power looked like. It was an incredibly interesting world that captured young Lyndon Johnson. So I really do believe that politics was inevitable for Lyndon Johnson.
Like in Karnak, people in Stonewall faced extreme poverty. But whereas Lady Bird came from money, Lyndon did not. The Johnson family prospered in the years that Sam served as a politician. Sam also tried to make it as a farmer. And during those years, the Johnsons lost all financial security. Farmers are reliant on things they have no control over, like the weather and land. But farmers are also reliant on the people who set the prices for crops. And when the prices drop, farming families can lose everything. Sam went through the cycle several times, trying to plant and sell cotton. But in 1920, when Lyndon was 12, his dad lost everything. Here's Mark Lawrence.
His father was a rags to riches figure. And I think it was through that experience of both poverty and relatively great opportunity that LBJ came to appreciate the fragility of prosperity.
Like Lady Bird, Lyndon started his education in a one-room schoolhouse, steps from the house he was born in. Unlike Lady Bird, Lyndon's report cards weren't filled with straight A's.
LBJ, by all accounts, was an indifferent student. His mother, for all her pleading with him, was disappointed at many points in the young LBJ's life about the seriousness with which he applied himself to his studies and the seriousness with which he put himself on a track to get out of the hill country and to find a bigger purpose and a bigger stage on which to live out his life.
In 1924, Lyndon graduated high school at 15 from Johnson City High School. Now, fittingly, it's called LBJ High School. His mom tried to get him to go to college, but Lyndon had other plans. He wandered between jobs, working as anything from an elevator operator to a road crew worker, building the road from Johnson City to Austin. He headed farther west, to California, working at a cousin's law firm. Lyndon felt restless, and eventually he got sick of a life without purpose. He saw education as his ticket out.
So he came back to Texas, kind of tail between his legs, and said essentially, okay, Mom, I'll really go to college now. And he wound up at Southwest Texas State Teachers College.
Lyndon started college in 1926. For the most part, he was still the same indifferent student he had been his whole life. But while there, Lyndon began to enter the world of college politics. That changed everything.
He was a kind of student government guy who ran for and won student positions, and also at the same time worked as a kind of campaign advisor to other students to help them win elections on campus. So he showed a real knack for politics, and no doubt he had picked up something from his father during earlier parts of his childhood, and showed a real talent, not only for getting himself elected, but for pulling the strings of even student politics.
Lyndon also began to work for the president of the college, making himself indispensable. He learned how power worked, and he learned that with power, he could get things done. Lyndon ran out of money by the time he finished his junior year of college, so he found a job teaching Mexican-American students in Cotulla, Texas. In Cotulla, Lyndon watched children pull grapefruit peels from the garbage just to suck the juice out. Lyndon also saw the effect that racism had on his students.
He understood how poverty could be blended with racial discrimination to produce a particularly virulent form of discrimination and inequality in American life.
Lyndon returned to college after Cotulla, having earned what he needed to pay for his final year of school. In 1930, he graduated with a degree in history. Since his childhood days, he saw the contrast of different worlds, prosperity and poverty, power and powerlessness. He began to figure out how to combine those worlds and what he'd do if given the chance.
I'm Catherine Robb, and I am Lady Bird Johnson's middle granddaughter. I am the fourth of 7, so I'm about as middle as you can get.
I spoke with Catherine in our studio in Austin. A few years after her grandmother passed away, Catherine decided to take a trip to East Texas. She traveled with her mom, Linda, and her sisters to see her grandmother's roots.
First of all, it was beautiful. I mean, she always talked about Caddo Lake with just sort of this twinkle in her eye. I mean, you could tell that it was a magical place to her. And once I saw it, I sort of understood, and we went once in the evening, kind of at night we went out on the lake, and then we went during the day. And I sort of finally got sort of how that sort of got into her soul and why it brought her such joy.
Next, on Lady Bird.
Made up my mind right then I wanted to come to the university to school and never changed it.
There's no question that somebody that ambitious, with such grand dreams, is going to be just satisfied with being a congressional aide.
So she told me I ought to meet this young man, and she was going to write him that I was coming to Washington.
Lady Bird is reported, written, and hosted by me, Jade Emerson. The executive producers of this podcast are Robert Quigley and Katie Penchik-Auka. Katie also did the audio editing and sound design. This podcast is presented by the Drag Audio Production House, which is a part of Texas Student Media at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication. This podcast was created in partnership with the LBJ Foundation. My producer on this podcast is Carly Rose, who is also the reporter and host of some of our bonus episodes. I couldn't have done it without her, honestly. Our cover art was an original painting and collage by Tamara Rodriguez, who was also an associate producer. Alexa Georgelos is our graphic designer. The other associate producers are Cameron Castellaw, Clara Dominic Smith, Alexandra Whitlock, Heather Stewart, Liv Gamble, Jackie Ibarra, Madison Olson, Lori Grobe, and Liam Quigley. The script editor is John Bridges. Christian McDonald is the drag's technical director. Grace Robertson is the drag's PR director, and Sofia Vargas Karam is the marketing director. A huge thank you to Leslie Schrock for all of her support and guidance. Valuable research and guidance were provided by Mark Lawrence, Mark Updegrove, and the LBJ Library staff, in particular, Sarah Cunningham. Shout out to Michael Gillette for his wonderful interviews with Lady Bird all those years ago. Special thanks to the University of Texas School of Journalism and Media and Texas Student Media. Also to Jay Bernhardt, Kathleen McElroy, David Reif, Gerald Johnson, Kevin Robbins, Kathleen Mabley, and Allison Dawson. Also, thanks to Emily Quigley, Ryan Outka, Kyla Reneker, Elizabeth Jackson, and Alice Rentz. A thanks also to several members of my journalism classes and of the public who gave feedback on early episodes. The Drag is a non-profit educational organization that is made possible by donors like you. Please support our work by going to thedragaudio.com/donate. Every dollar goes directly to producing more content like this while giving students an amazing educational experience. Thank you.